Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for October 25th, 2023. One of the more famous statements from President John F. Kennedy from his inaugural address in 1961 was, "Never let us negotiate out of fear, but never let us fear to negotiate." One wonders what it is that Biden fears about negotiations. Why the West is committed to a course in Ukraine, now in Gaza, of war to the bitter end, a permanent warfare. There was a UN resolution last week calling for negotiations for a ceasefire. 12 of the 15 UN Security Council members voted for it, a couple abstained, and the US alone vetoed the resolution. There was a debate yesterday where 90 speakers signed up to speak. Virtually every nation calling for a ceasefire, for a negotiated settlement. The lone exception, well, Israel and the United States. The UN Secretary General Guterres decried the loss of life on both sides. He called for Hamas to free the hostages they have, saying there's no justification for the, quote, horrifying and unprecedented October 7th acts of terror, unquote, committed by Hamas. However, he said, those acts, quote, cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people, unquote. He described Israel's attacks on Gaza as, quote, clear violations of international humanitarian law, unquote, and criticizing especially the forced evacuation of over 1 million Palestinians from the north to the south of Gaza, while cutting off food, medicine, and fuel, and continuing to bomb the south. What sense does it make to force people to evacuate, saying that they can have, they'll be safer when they evacuate, and then bombing them as they're evacuating? This is the Israeli policy which is fully endorsed and embraced by Joe Biden, despite his calls for protecting the rights of Palestinians. Now, after Guterres spoke, the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen responded by denouncing Guterres and defending the Netanyahu regime policy. He said that they believe the only proportionate response to Hamas is the, quote, total destruction of Hamas. The Palestinian foreign minister had a different view. He said, only peace can make Israel safer. Now, figures coming out from aid agencies, not just the Palestinians, but even the UN Relief Agency, point out that 40% of the nearly 6,000 people killed so far in Gaza, 40% are children. How does killing children put an end to terror? How does killing children put an end to a cycle of violence and make it safer for people in Israel? Biden reasserted his policy. He doubled down, full support for Netanyahu, no ceasefire. And then Blinken, the immoral hypocrite, was sent in front of the United Nations to talk about how the attacks on Gaza are justified. Now, Blinken, of course, when I say he's an immoral hypocrite, that's just not rhetoric. He's already on record for defending the deaths of children as a result of sanctions placed on Syria by the United States. So when he speaks of humanitarian concerns for the Palestinian people, just as he did for humanitarian concerns about the people of Syria, as he continued the murderous sanctions policy, this is a man who needs to be brought to account. His mentor, Madeleine Albright, defended the death of 500,000 Iraqi children due to sanctions in the 1990s. When is the unlawful regime running policy out of Washington going to be brought to account? Now, in his speech, Blinken went on to threaten a swift and decisive action against Iran if it intervenes, thereby laying the basis for World War III. Keep in mind, there are 2 U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups in the region, and with 10,000 troops and another 2,000 on ready reserve. Lindsey Graham who's a completely unhinged war hawk, led a delegation to Jerusalem, where he called for preemptive strikes against Iran. Now, the question has to be asked, what is Biden's endgame? If he says there'll be no negotiations, either between Russia and Ukraine or with Israel over the Gaza situation, what's his endgame? Remember, he was an enthusiastic supporter of the Bush-Cheney war in Iraq, which was based on complete lies. He worked closely with Hillary Clinton in the destruction of Libya and was the point man for Ukraine when Victoria Nuland was there handing out cookies in the Maidan Square to Nazi terrorists who carried out a regime change coup in 2014 when Nuland famously said to the U.S. ambassador, "Who should be the next ruler in Ukraine?" This is the rules-based order. The rules made up by Washington and London, enforced by U.S. military and NATO, and this is what is giving the go-ahead to Netanyahu to commit genocide against the Palestinian people. Now, an older generation of Israelis and Palestinians, which had been locked in combat, locked in a cycle of violence for many years, reached the conclusion that more violence wasn't a solution. Yitzhak Rabin, who had served as the head of the Israel Defense Forces, as defense minister, and twice as prime minister, in his earlier incarnation as prime minister and defense minister, carried out brutal assaults on the Palestinians during the Second Intifada. But he came to realize that that was not going to bring peace to Israel. And he reached across to Yasser Arafat, who had, as the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, authorized terror strikes not just against Israel, but against the West. Here you had two leaders who were part of this cycle of violence, who came to realize that the only solution would be peace. And what's the basis for that peace? Mutual economic benefit, which was the idea that was incorporated by Lyndon LaRouche in his original drafting of what became known as the Oasis Plan, which was incorporated in the overall idea of the Oslo Accord. The idea that the Israelis and the Palestinians work together to expand the amount of useful water through canals, through desalination, through nuclear power plants, using the excess, or the increase, I should say, in electricity to carry out an improvement in industrial and agricultural productivity for all people in the region. This is the idea of the Oslo Accord, which was sabotaged by allies of Netanyahu who murdered Yitzhak Rabin. Now, some will say, well, how do you say those are allies of Netanyahu? It's the violent rhetoric against the Palestinian state, which led to Netanyahu to fund Hamas to undermine the authority of the Palestinian Authority, the successor to Arafat's PLO. That's what Netanyahu did, just as Biden authorized, or was part of the authorization under the Obama administration, of funding and training to ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Iraq to try to overthrow the government of Assad in Syria. So we have a case where you have genocidal lunatics, Netanyahu, and now Biden. Is Biden mentally conscious of what he's doing? Well, given the consistency of this with his policy back in the 2002-2003 period, the only conclusion could be that if he's senile now, what was he then? He's a war hawk. Hardcore commitment to the military-industrial complex to defend what they call the unipolar order, and the moves toward a multipolar order from nations of the world that reject violence and that instead want mutually beneficial economic development. That's what's driving the controllers of the Biden administration to reject negotiations and go for permanent warfare. I'm going to link in the description section today a 2010 video that we made on the Oasis Plan, which will give you a sense of the economic basis for peace. I also will link an op-ed in the Washington Post by Josh Paul, a State Department official who is involved in a coordinator of policy planning for weapons transfers, who resigned from the administration because of the stifling of debate. Debate must not be stifled, it must be encouraged, and not just debate, but an end to war, an end to the control of policies of governments by the corporate cartels of the military-industrial complex and the financial and insurance industries, which insist on maintaining the unipolar order. So thanks for joining me today. Take a look at what I've linked, share them, share this video, and I'll be back again tomorrow.